Okay, awesome. Well, welcome. I'm Kara Ripley. I'm the Adult Services Librarian across the street there at the library, and I'm really excited tonight to have Theresa Nelson with us to talk about native plants. In 2 weeks, we have another program where we will do some winter sowing, and she'll be leading that one as well. And I'm sure Theresa will have lots to talk about. She is known in the community as a member of the Oregon Nature Alliance and provides great leadership about nature things. So really happy to have Theresa with us tonight. And so here we are.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kara and the library, for having me here tonight. I'm glad to see so many people in person, and I know we have some people online as well. So welcome, everybody. Tonight, I think I have around an hour of presentation. Kind of depends on how many questions we get. Feel free, for those of you in the room, to ask questions as we move along. If it's something that I'll talk about later, I'll just say wait, and you'll hear it in a little bit. So feel free to do that. And yeah, with that, I think we'll get moving. So just an idea of what we're going to talk about tonight. It's really like the who, what, where, why, how of native plants. So we're going to talk about what is a native plant, why are they important, what you can do to help them, and then how do you go about doing that. So we're going to cover a lot of different things. But first, just a little bit about me. I grew up gardening with my mom, and when I got my own house, I joined the Master Gardener program and was very involved with the Greene County Master Gardener group for a number of years. And one of the things that I did there was help put in a bird and butterfly garden outside one of the local nursing homes. And I got all these plants and I put them in the ground, and then they said, "What are these?" And I said, "I'm not sure. I will figure it out." And it was kind of through that process of looking at the plant, looking at the flower, trying to figure out what its name was, getting to know the plants, that really started to get me into native plants. And then once you kind of learn that, you start seeing them places, and then it just sort of grows from there. But then when I moved to Oregon and built a house, I did want to put some native plants in there, and I didn't want to pay for all of the native plants because it can get kind of expensive. So through some of the connections I had in the community and some research online, I started growing native plants and ended up with a lot of plants. And so I did a little garage sale of plants, and I've just kind of continued to grow plants since then. That was, I think, 2014, 2015 when I started growing native plants. And now I grow over 100 species of native plants in my backyard and in the house and every place that I can find a spot for plants. And I don't do this as a day job. I'm a stormwater engineer, and I have degrees in physics and civil engineering, but all of my native plant knowledge has come through experience and reading. I've read a lot of books. I'm very interested in it, and so today I'm going to share with you the things that I've learned along the way. I do get to do a little bit of native plants with my job, but so that's kind of fun that I do get to work in that sort of hobby along with it, but most of this is really just a hobby. And then a little bit about the Oregon Nature Alliance, for those of you who don't know. We are a group that formed in the village about 2 years ago. And really our purpose is to, we sort of found that there was not a voice for environmental sustainability in the village, and so we're trying to provide that voice. So we advocate for environmental sustainability in the village through going to village meetings and talking to our village board members. We provide opportunities to connect people to nature, because when you know something and love something, you're more apt to protect that thing. We provide educational opportunities. We go to National Night Out, and we'll be at Winterfest in a few weeks here. And then we also work to put habitat on the ground, and that's through our SHARE program, where we visit people in people's yards in town and talk about ways that they can improve habitat. And then if they want, we plant a native plant garden for them. So we've done that for about 20 gardens, 20 yards over the last 2 years. So if you're interested in the Oregon Nature Alliance, you can find us on Facebook. There's a link to sign up to be a member. Being a member just puts you on our email list, and you can find out what we have going on. So with that, we're going to get into things. And if we're going to talk about native plants, we need to make sure that we all know what a native plant is. And you can find a number of different definitions of native plant out there. Some of them refer to plants that were here prior to European settlement. But the definition that I really like is what's on the screen here, is native plants are natural to the area in which they are found and are specifically adapted to that particular ecosystem. So like the important words there are natural and adapted. These plants have been here for thousands of years. They have adapted and evolved with the insects, the animals, the climate, the soils, and it's all of that complex relationship that really makes that a native plant. It participates in the ecosystem, whereas plants that have come over even maybe hundreds of years ago from Europe, from Asia, they haven't had that time to go through that process of adapting and being useful to the other things in the ecosystem. So if we talk about native plants, we can talk about, well, how do we refer to non-native plants? Well, that's one way, but we can also, people refer to them as inventive, exotic, alien. And then there's also some confusion about, non-native, invasive, what's an invasive plant? And generally, invasive plants refer to non-native plants that kind of take over and displace local ecosystems. So things like in the picture, garlic mustard will completely take over the understory of a forest. And so they don't allow anything else to grow. The native plants can't grow. The tree seedlings can't grow. And that's a plant that was brought over from Europe, a long time ago, and it keeps spreading. So that's one of the things that we, call invasive. So just to kind of whet your appetite, here are some pictures of some native plants. This is pale purple coneflower. This picture was taken at Keller Alpine Meadows Park. And this is showy goldenrod, and you can see there's a butterfly. This is a plant that's used quite a bit late in the season as a nectar source for butterflies. And there's even a little bee down in there if you can find that. This is spiderwort. Has kind of a unique color. You don't see many blues in flowers in native plants. It's an early spring blooming flower. This is a native plant too, and is one of the names is ghost plant. And the reason that it's white is it's a parasitic plant, so it doesn't produce its own chlorophyll. You'll find it on the base of stumps because it gets its nutrients from decaying matter and tree roots and fungi. It's really a quite interesting plant, and it's actually in the blueberry family, and it's pollinated by small bumblebees. And this is Virginia bluebells. This is an early spring ephemeral, so it grows early. It's a woodland plant that grows in the forest before all the leaves come out, so it basically does its whole thing right away in the spring, flowers, produces seeds, and then dies back by the summertime. So there are a lot of different ephemeral plants like that. And these are just a few native plants, and I picked some really pretty pictures. But their benefits go beyond that aesthetic value to our human eye. So let's talk about why these plants are important. Well, here's an image that kind of shows, the circle of life. So you have the plants that are absorbing energy from the sun, and then they're using that. They're taking that energy from the sun, and they're creating food for insects, for birds. Birds eat the insects. Other things eat the birds. It goes around and round, and then there's a decaying process where insects are involved again. Then they create, more soil to grow more plants. Okay, this is great. We all understand, food webs and basic things like that. But why is it important that they're native plants? I mean, all plants absorb energy from the sun. Why do we need native plants? Well, it turns out that insects are pretty picky, and they 90% of our native insects are specialists, meaning that they only eat certain kind of plants. And if that plant doesn't exist, that insect does not have any food. Like, they're like, I don't care what you put in front of me, I'm only gonna eat mashed potatoes. And if there's no mashed potatoes, I'm not eating anything. And monarchs are an example of this. Monarchs have adapted to eat milkweed. Milkweed is a toxic plant. They have adapted not only to eat that plant, but then to move that toxin into their bodies so that they become toxic. So, if a bird tries to eat a little monarch caterpillar, it might not taste so good, and they might spit that caterpillar out. And what's even more amazing is they then move that toxin from their caterpillar bodies into the wings of the butterfly. So the butterfly is like flying poison. So this is an example of a specialist insect that only eats certain plants. If there's no milkweed, there's no monarch butterflies, there's no monarch caterpillars, and a lot of our insects are that way. Okay, so we need native plants to have insects. Why do we really care about insects? Well, if we think about that circle of life in that food web, birds eat caterpillars and insects, and actually it takes thousands of caterpillars for a bird to raise a single clutch of young birds. So that's a lot of caterpillars to raise some little birds, and those parent birds will actually go back and forth to the nest hundreds of times a day, bringing those little, as I like to call them bug sausages, because the way they're described, they're very, they're protein rich. Caterpillars are. They have very soft bodies. They're very easy to feed, young baby birds. And the thing is, they need thousands, and they can't. If they're coming back and forth hundreds of times, they can't be flying miles and miles away to get that food. Those food sources need to be nearby. We need the native plants nearby to do that. So native plants provide a lot of benefits to the whole ecosystem, but there are benefits that they provide us humans, and sometimes we like to call those ecosystem services. And one of the things that native plants do is they move carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. And an acre of prairie will absorb 1 to 2 tons of carbon per acre per year. And as those prairies develop, that just gets to be more and more. So, thinking about climate change and absorbing some of that carbon out of our atmosphere, native plants can do that. And then that carbon is sunk into the ground. If there is a fire, if you had a forest, a lot of that carbon gets released. But in a prairie, most of that carbon is down into the ground. So you can burn a prairie and you're not losing a lot of that carbon that's been sequestered. And if you think about, if we could change the way we manage our land, we can also improve the air quality. Less lawn, if we replace lawn with native plants, then we don't have to mow the lawn using motors and fossil fuels. Running a lawnmower for an hour is like driving a car 100 miles. They produce a lot of emissions, and the less we can mow, the better for the air and the environment. Native plants also help with our soil. They help stabilize the soil and control erosion. They're very good at stabilizing slopes. Native grasses have very fibrous roots that sort of hold the soil together. They also build the soil. So as they're bringing those nutrients down into the soil, the roots are dying off and growing new ones. So they really build up the soil. And it's no coincidence that the best farmland in the US are the areas that used to be prairie. They called it breaking the prairie to create those agricultural fields. So very nutrient-rich soil. And then our native plants support our pollinators, and pollinators pollinate 87% of all plants. So 87% of the plants need insects in order to reproduce. Pollination is the process of reproduction. And 90% of flowering plants need pollinators. And a third of our human food crops need pollinators. So, apples, blueberries, tomatoes, strawberries, all of that we would not have if we did not have insects that would do that pollination work. And as a side note, honeybees are not a native insect. They were brought over from Europe. They do some pollination, but there are a lot of native bees and native insects that do that just as well, if not better. And they have shown that honeybees do or can compete with the native insects for food and things like that. So go native bees and honeybees. Yeah, people like honey, but if we really want the ecosystems to thrive, we need to support those native bees. And then finally, native plants can help us with water quality. They have very deep root systems. Those roots, about a third of them die off every year and then are replaced, and those sort of dead root channels help provide places for that water to soak into the ground. And they also can kind of soak up pollutants as things go into the ground as well. A prairie can absorb 9 inches of rain, which is pretty amazing when you think about, well, man, we're getting these bigger and bigger rainstorms. If we convert more land to prairie and native vegetation, we can really do a lot to mitigate flooding by absorbing that water into the land as opposed to it running off. And this is just an image that kind of shows some of those differences between root structures of some of the more common non-native plants, spirea, daylilies, you see those everywhere. They have root systems that maybe go down 1 to 2 feet, whereas some of the native plants can go down up to 15 feet. And you'll see our little turf grass there has root systems that go down a couple inches. They do very little to improve the soil. Turf grass does not provide really great infiltration. If we really want to improve our soil, improve our infiltration, we should be looking at planting more native plants. So the native plants have all these benefits, but really there are a lot of really big threats to them and the ecosystems that they support. Some of those main threats include chemical pesticides. Think about all of the agricultural crops that are sprayed, thinking about all of our lawns that are sprayed and things like that. Chemical pesticides are a pretty big problem. Invasive species, like I said, those plants that came in from other areas that kind of take over and they displace, if there were native plants there, they're not there now because those invasive species have taken over. And climate change. One of the things that I think people don't think about so much, you think about, okay, changing temperatures and some of the changing weather patterns, but what that changing temperature and changing weather patterns can do is they can throw off the synchronization of when a plant flowers and when an insect emerges and needs that plant. Again, over the thousands of years that these things have evolved together, the timing of these things is important, and climate change could potentially throw that off. So, an insect could emerge and the plant that it needs is not ready or has bloomed and died already. So that's kind of a big impact with climate change. And then just habitat loss. We've, created cities, we've created farm fields, we've broken the prairies. A lot of it's gone. Most of it is gone. And we're not doing a very good job of bringing it back. So when I think about, these main threats, one of the things that's right there in our backyards is the lawn. America's obsession with lawns and that green, pristine look. Lawns are the largest irrigated crop in the U.S. They cover the size of an area of Texas. And nobody eats them. They're not used for anything but to look at and to, as this says, to make us feel good about ourselves. And so what does it take to keep lawns like that? Well, it takes a lot of spraying, pesticides and herbicides, and it kills everything. It takes a lot of fertilizer. Some of that fertilizer runs off, goes into our water bodies, creates algae blooms, travels down to the Gulf of Mexico, creates dead zones. It's a big deal. And then, all of the mowing. So, you're fertilizing these lawns, they're growing like crazy. You got to keep mowing them, and that's more air pollution from those mowers. And really, like the other landscaping we do is not all that much better. We plant things like hostas in a sea of mulch that we have to refresh every year. And this is not contributing to our ecosystems. We don't want stuff to eat our hostas. I mean, we don't want things to bite that. But if nothing's eating them, they're not really participating in our ecosystem. And you know, the impacts of all this is really starting to come to light. Is an article from the New York Times Magazine. There's some pretty big issues with insect decline. There was a study done in Germany that looked at the biomass of flying insects in some of their protected, like, natural areas, and over 27 years that biomass declined by 76%. That's a lot in just 30 years. But if we look at the monarch butterfly population, that's dropped 90% in the last 20 years. Bumblebee populations have dropped 96% in the last 20 years. That's huge. If you had started out with 100, you only have 4 left. I mean, it's amazing that we haven't seen kind of bigger impacts from this yet. But I think all of us here can remember when we were younger and you would have to stop by the gas station just to clear off your windshield because it was full of bug guts. I never do that anymore. I hardly even notice when if bugs hit my windshield. They're not here. They're gone. So we need to do something. We need to change the way we're managing our land, and really, now we're talking like what can we do about it? And what I'm going to tell you is you start where you have control. You have your yard, you have maybe a business, you have potentially some land that you can control. Even if you don't, you can work other places to do that. But there's a lot of things that we can do right at home that can help kind of reverse some of this habitat loss, reverse some of the bad practices that we've been doing. The National Wildlife Federation puts out a really nice, they do a certification for wildlife, I think it's wildlife yard or garden for wildlife. And they talk about the things that you can do in your yard to improve habitat. And one of those things is provide food. And the best food that we can do is plant native plants. That is the food that things need. Some of the other things that you can do, add a water source, even a small bird bath is very useful in that respect. Providing cover, so planting some trees or some shrubs together so that birds have some place to kind of go and hide from predators, also little tiny animals, and then having places for raising young. And then along with that, along with sort of doing those things in your yard, maybe stop doing some things. Eliminate pesticides and herbicides and fertilizer use. Start doing some sustainable practices. Conserve soil and water. People that have those nice bright green lawns, they keep them green all summer because they're using, they're irrigating their lawns. We don't need to do that. And then controlling invasive species. And one of the things that you can do for that is just start to learn what some of the common invasive species are. In the yards that I've visited over the last couple years, there's been 20-foot tall buckthorn trees, and buckthorn is a highly invasive shrub tree that produces berries, and then the birds eat the berries and they spread them everywhere, and you will have a forest floor covered in buckthorn. And people are like, oh, I want to save this tree. I'm like, do you know what this is? Please cut it down. So just learning about some of those more common ones and taking a look around your yard. Do I have some of these here? What can I do to get rid of them? But really, in the words of entomologist and author Doug Talmy, we need to bring nature home. We no longer can afford to visit nature on the weekends because there's not much left. I mean, we can't rely on publicly owned lands because 90% of the land in the United States is privately owned. There's just not enough to rely on somebody else to do this work. There's not enough conservation professionals to do this on their own. We have to help. And we can't do it just all by ourselves, because if we do it, but we're not providing those connections we still have fragmented habitats which don't allow those wildlife and other things to move and have the space that they need. You can do some with a little, but if you connect it with your neighbor, who connects it to their neighbor, who connects it to the park that hopefully we can plant in native plants, that's a much larger area that provides more habitat than each of those individual ones by themselves. So we need to connect habitats, because some of these insects they don't fly very far to find their food. Oregon itself is about 2 miles wide, so monarch butterfly, yeah, it goes to Mexico. It can go around a few places, but a bumblebee really only travels about 1 mile. So a bumblebee couldn't go from one side of Oregon to the other to find food. We got to provide some spaces in between. And then if you think about what they have on the bottom of here, bicolored green sweat bee, only travels about 500 feet. That's like 1 to 2 blocks. So we really can't do this alone. We have to encourage our friends and neighbors to do this as well. Any questions coming up yet? All right, this sounds really great. So how do we do this? How can we incorporate native plants into our yards? Well, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. It doesn't have to be like, I have to get rid of all of my lawn and plant a prairie. There's a lot of ways you can do it. So you can incorporate native plants into existing garden beds. That's probably the easiest thing, because then you don't really have to do a whole lot of prep or anything. This is actually, my neighbors have a lot of native plants because I give them plants. So this is one of my neighbors, and this is brown fox sedge that we planted along the front of their retaining wall, because they said, oh, this is a spot, anything I plant here, nothing grows. And really, again, it's about finding putting the right plant in the right place. And this plant was the right plant for the right place. It's been doing really well there. Another existing garden bed that we did through the Oregon Nature Alliance, before we got there, it had, I think, a weeping cherry and another little plant, and that was really about it. We added 15 native plants to that garden bed, and in the picture here, they're pretty small, but we provided flowering plants from. We had spring plants and summer plants. I don't think we managed to get any fall flowering plants in there, but really improved the diversity quite a bit in that small little garden bed. And we just dug in and put some plants in. We didn't have to do any prep or anything. And this is another one of my neighbors who had just a little spot along the corner of their garage where their sidewalk kind of went around to their side door. I think it had a spirea in it, which we left, but then we planted a whole bunch of other native plants in there, and that butterfly weed, the orange there, just loved it. It was a great spot. I go back and I collect seeds from that plant because it's doing really well there. And so finding other opportunities around your yard for incorporating native plants. Shady spots are great because a lot of what we try to grow there does not grow very well because we're not putting the right plant in the right place. There are a lot of native plants that will grow just fine in dry shade, like underneath this tree. Clearly they did not have very much luck growing things under this one. And it's important to provide those, what they can call soft landings underneath trees, because a lot of insects will feed on the trees, and then to complete their life cycle, they drop from the trees to the ground, and then they burrow in and make a cocoon or something like that. But they can't do that if underneath the tree is lawn and turf grass that keeps getting mowed and sprayed and things like that. So wherever you can, provide those soft landings, leave the leaves there, plant native plants under it, don't mow it, don't compact it. Give those creatures that are using those trees some place to land so that they can kind of complete their life cycle and move along. Another place that I think is a really good opportunity for incorporating native plants are, well, I call soggy spots. Places in your yard where either it's like in the spring, sort of seasonally, it kind of floods, or if we get a lot of rain in the summer, the grass doesn't grow very well, it's hard to mow through there. stop trying to do that. Plant some plants that like it wetter in those areas. You'll give yourself something really beautiful to look at. You won't have as much to mow. You won't have to look at the spots in your yard that are dead from water sitting there. Put the plants there that want to be there. And finally, you can create new garden beds. And there's a lot of opportunities to put those around your yard. The one up in the upper right is a garden bed I just added to my yard along my garage in a very hot, dry, sunny spot. So I put plants that like it hot and dry and sunny. I planted some plants around a mailbox. Again, trying to keep those a little bit smaller so they don't overwhelm things. But there are a lot of opportunities, and don't be afraid to start small. Dig up a little bit of a lawn, but don't go crazy, because you do have to dig, mulch, and we'll talk about the things that you need to do in just a little bit. And even if you don't have really any yard, you can still have native plants. There are numerous native plants that will do just fine in containers. So don't let that stop you. If you have a balcony, you can have some native plants in your yard. So if we can kind of find spots to put those, but how do we plan where to put the plants? Really, native garden design is, you're thinking about some of the same things that you would think about if you were doing any other kind of garden design. You want to think about sun and soil and moisture, how big the plants are going to be, when do they bloom, and maybe providing some of those other habitat benefits as you go along. We're not going to get into real big detail on this, because you could go way down this rabbit hole, but we will talk about some of these aspects. So sun exposure. There's the terms, your sun, partial sun, shade. What does that really mean? Well, for sun, think about these are the plants that grew really in the open prairie. So they're getting at least 6 hours of sun a day. Part sun, part shade, those are the plants that grew in the oak savanna, so they had maybe some dappled shade from an open canopy oak. They're the plants that grow kind of on the edge of the woodland, so maybe they get part of the day sun, part of the day shade. So 4 to 6 hours of sunlight would be your partial sun, partial shade kind of condition. And then shade is really less than 4 hours of direct sunlight a day. Those are the plants that grow in the woods, in the woodland. So they prefer, if they are getting some sun, you prefer that to be kind of the morning sun or the evening sun. Plants that want it shady don't want to get direct sunlight in the middle of the day. And then know your soil. Do you have sandy soil? Do you have clay soil? Most of the soil in Dane County is a silt loam, which is a fairly well-drained soil, but obviously we've done a lot of changes to the soils. When we create houses, we basically strip all the topsoil off, we build our house, and then we put back some of it, usually not a lot. So what you have in your yard might not be what was there originally. But if you want to do a simple test, you can take some scoops of soil, put it in a jar with some water and shake it up, and then set it down and look at it the next day, and it will settle into those different parts. And doing a little Google search for jar soil test will give you all the instructions for doing that. But it's kind of good to know, if you have sandy soil, then it's probably going to be a drier soil, because sand tends to let that water move through pretty quickly. Whereas if you have more of a clay soil, clays tend to hold on to that water a lot longer, and so you might have more of a higher moisture condition in your yard. When we're talking about native plants, we don't need to amend the soil. We don't need to change it. We're trying to put the plants there that will be happy with the conditions that exist. We're not trying to change the conditions. So no fertilizer is necessary. Most woodland plants would like about 40% organic matter. So you might find that you have a shady spot and you want to put some woodland plants, but because of all of the changes that were done, you might need to add a little compost or some other organic matter to make those plants just a little bit happier. Most grassland plants thrive in drier soils, so those more well-drained sandy soils, and those wetland plants really like that richer soil. And one of the terms that you might find when you start looking at soil moisture conditions for native plants is mesic. And that really just means medium soils. So not dry, not wet, in the middle, medium, mesic. And this just shows, your upland is your dry area, and then working your way down into, pretty much the edge of the water, and that's going to be your wetter zone. And there's, some variation in between there. And there's different plants that like to be in those different zones. And when you look up information about plants, it's going to tell you that, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Actually, right now. So this is a screenshot from one of the native plant nursery websites, and that's where you want to go to find your information about native plants, because they give you a lot. So this is an example of what they have for butterfly weed, and they give you some information about seeds and germination code, and we're not going to talk about that tonight. We can talk about that in 2 weeks. But they talk, there's life cycle, so it's a perennial. Some native plants are biennial. They'll grow and have leaves the first year. The second year they'll put up a flower, and then they're done. They're gone. But they spread seeds, and so you might find them somewhere else. It's just that particular plant will not last more than a year or two. Annual plants only last a year, so they do all of their reproducing in 1 year. They tend to produce a lot of seeds, so you probably will see them again, but again, it won't be the same plant. Sun exposure, so butterfly weed can handle full or partial sun. Soil moisture, this plant likes it in that medium to dry, so more of the upland area. Generally the height of 2 feet. Now the thing with heights of native plants is it really depends on where they're planted, what the conditions are, what's planted around them. So when you look at what they say for heights, it's going to be an average. Sometimes it might be a little shorter, sometimes it might be a little taller. A lot of times when we start out planting native plant gardens, our plants aren't very close together, and when they don't have that root competition, they tend to get a lot bigger. But as time goes on and things kind of fill in, and that underground area starts filling in, those plants might not get as tall as things develop. Bloom time, so this blooms generally June, July, August. The color is orange. They give some advantages. So, if this is a plant that pollinators like, or bees, or maybe the deer mostly leave it alone, I would take the no deer, no rabbit thing with a grain of salt, because, if animals are hungry enough, they're going to eat just about anything. Anybody who's familiar with gardening, it's all about, the USDA zone. Forget that with native plants. You're trying to find what's native to this area, not that will grow, all the way out to the east or the west coast as long as the temperatures are the same. That's not what this is about. So, even though they put it on here, ignore that part. And then they have plant spacing. So this is good when you're trying to plan out that garden and how much space do I need to give this plant when it's bigger. And I would always go towards the smaller side, because you do want to plant things close together so that it fills in quickly. You get that competition, you get that weed suppression by having all those plants. So I generally say plant native plants about 1 foot apart, almost no matter what. Because even the bigger ones, okay, this one here is going to get a lot bigger, so maybe these ones down here eventually die out because they're not getting enough sun, but that's all right because it's got another big plant here. So closer is better, in my opinion. And there's a lot of, if you don't know where to start as far as, where do I put what plant, there are a lot of examples out there that you can use. This one is from Prairie Nursery, and they'll have, a sunny garden and a pollinator garden and a shady garden. And you can just go to these, especially the local native nurseries, and you could just buy those plants. You could lay it out the same way, and you should have some pretty good success. You can, there's other ones, this one gets really fancy and tries to show what the plants might look like. But this is also an example of some of the things you can think about when you're trying to decide what plant should go where. Kind of like with traditional landscape garden planning, you want to put taller plants in the back if it's some place that you're sort of looking at it from one direction, or put the taller plants in the middle and the shorter ones along the outside. Really you want a mix of flowering plants and grass-like plants because again, they kind of occupy different areas of the soil root zone, and you want to give those competition. So you don't want to have all grasses or all flowers. You want a good mix, and even go a little bit heavier on the grasses is what I would suggest. And then the other thing that you want to look at is, trying to get things that bloom throughout the year. That's going to be the most beneficial to pollinators because, they come out April and they need flowers. So we need to plant things that bloom early all the way to the end, and those monarch butterflies that are getting their last fuel before they make their way to Mexico. And you can do your own plans. Graph paper works really great for that. Again, like I said, you can use the plant spacing guidelines from those native nursery websites to figure out kind of how big these are going to get, or just kind of go with the 1 foot on center idea. One of my favorite things for doing small gardens is just to use PowerPoint, because you can make circles and make it an inch big, and you make your garden bed 4 inches by 8 inches, however big, 4 feet by 8 feet. And then they're really easy to move around. Because if you start drawing on graph paper, I find that there's a lot of erasing that goes on. And then you can make them the same color as what they bloom. So I tend to do a lot of, if you're doing smaller gardens, this works really quite well. And if you need help, the Wild Ones Madison chapter is doing a Plan Your Own Pollinator event this weekend, Saturday. Unfortunately, I think they're full. They're full up. But you could still sign up and get on the waiting list, because I think they're going to do another one of these where they're going to offer one-on-one advice for creating native plant gardens. And the people that are going to be there are people that know their stuff. If you don't know, Wild Ones is an organization, it's a national organization that was started, I think, in the Appleton area in Wisconsin. And it's, they're devoted to promoting the restoration of native communities throughout the US. And they are kind of, I'd say, more focused on kind of urban areas and kind of incorporating them into your landscapes. So it's a great organization. If you don't know about them, you can look up. They've got native plant designs on their website as well. So if we have a plan, how do we go from our plan to kind of implementation? So there, if you're creating a new garden, there are a few steps that you should go to so that your plants will have the greatest success. And those are vegetation removal. Edging is optional, but I'll tell you some reasons why you might want to do that. Mulching, very important. Methods for planting, and then what you have to think about kind of to maintain it. And the first thing that you need to make sure that you are removing from any place you're going to invest in native plants is invasive species. Because if you don't do that, they're just going to be a problem moving forward, and then you'll have to figure out how to get rid of them while still protecting your native plants. So these are some very common invasive species. Garlic mustard tends to grow in more shady areas. Creeping Charlie grows pretty much everywhere. I think a lot of people know that one. Creeping bellflower, I think, is one that not a lot of people know because it's so ubiquitous in people's gardens, and they're like, oh, I have these pretty flowers, and now I have them all over here. But it's a hard one to get rid of. Dame's rocket blooms in the spring, and the roadsides look very beautiful, but when you know that it's a bad plant, that beauty is reduced, in my opinion. Canada thistle is another one that's really, really hard to get rid of. So I would, if you have these in the area that you want to do your native garden, I would suggest you Googling to find out the most effective way to get rid of them. And this is one condition or one situation where I think using herbicide is valid, is useful. And people have different opinions on the use of herbicide, but sometimes it is really the only effective way to get rid of some of these plants that we do not want here. So other things, you might be doing your native plant garden in an area that was turf grass. So there's different ways that you can remove that. You can use a tiller if you have that. The one thing about tilling is that when you till the soil, you're bringing up all of the weed seeds that maybe are buried up to the surface. So if you are going to do something like tilling, I would recommend doing it, waiting a couple weeks to see what grows there again, and maybe tilling again, doing that a few times until you get rid of all that. Otherwise, what we'll get to in the next part with mulching is very heavily mulch that area. So that the least amount of disturbance is usually the best as far as not encouraging more weed growth. Some other methods, if you have a strong husband and a willing child, you can have them manually remove the sod, or you can rent a sod cutter or things like that. It's kind of it gets really heavy when you're pulling that off. You can use cardboard in a layer of mulch to smother the grass. Sometimes it's best, people suggest waiting a couple months or a few months after you do that to plant so that the grass dies before you plant. I'll be honest, I never wait. I cover it in cardboard, I put the mulch down, and then I plant right into it. And really, you don't have that much grass that is still going to try to come up. You might have some that tries to come up right next to your plants, but it's pretty manageable to get rid of. So you can do it either way. And then another method shown on the bottom is solarization. So using plastic to heat up the ground to kill the vegetation. That takes a long time again. And then another useful use of herbicide is to kill the grass and then plant right into it. Then you're not bringing up any other weed seeds. It provides a good base to keep the weeds away while your native plants get bigger. So that is another method of vegetation removal. And edging, I kind of debated on whether I was going to do edging with the rain garden in my front yard because I didn't think it was necessary. I ended up putting it there because it is my front yard. None of my neighbors have this kind of landscaping, so I thought, well, this is just sort of a cue to show them that this is an important area. It's not a patch of weeds. And then the other benefit is it does help prevent the grass from growing into your garden. So that's one of the uses for edging. It prevents that grass from migrating into your garden, and it also provides that, they call it cues to care. Like, this isn't a weed patch, this is intentional, there's purpose to this. Other things that you can do is putting in signs or little pieces of art or things like that. I just didn't let it go, this is intentional. So there's obviously different ways to do edging. You can use bricks, you can use old logs, and if you don't want to use anything, you can do a cut down into the ground. And as long as you kind of maintain that helps keep the grass out as well. And then mulching, very important. Like I said, I use cardboard down, and then I do 2 to 3 inches of mulch. And then I plant directly into that. And I think I have a picture coming up to show that. But the picture on the bottom left is my rain garden kind of right after it was planted. So you obviously can see all that mulch, the little tiny plants. Well, the picture on the lower right is that same garden a few years later. You don't see the mulch. There's no need to put more mulch in there. The plants are suppressing the weeds. So it makes it a lot easier to maintain as opposed to our traditional kind of, we have our little plant and we have a lot of mulch and we have to put new mulch on it every year so it looks good. Plant your plants close together. They will keep the weeds down and you won't have to remulch anything. And then planting. It's always good to have some help when you plant. And like I said, you can plant directly into that mulch. You don't have to move the mulch aside and put the plant down at the soil surface. And there's evidence that you don't need to do this because I drilled 300 to 400 holes in that garden bed outside of Netherwood Knoll Elementary School, and I used a little bulb auger, very useful. And then I let 50 second graders plant all the plants there. Most of them mostly made it into the ground. I went back and I pushed a few more in, but that garden now is incredible. It's beautiful, and it wasn't hard to do. And the kids had a lot of fun doing that. So then maintenance. One of the things that you can do to make your life much easier, especially if you're not very familiar with native plants, is to put a tag by your native plant when you plant it. That way, the next spring when things start coming up and you're like, did I plant that? Or is that a weed? I'm not sure. And I do this too, because I'll go in and I'm like, oh, that's totally a weed. And I pull it and I'm like, oh, look, that's potting mix. That was a plant that I put there. So do yourself a favor, putting tags there, at least for the first couple years, that allows you to see what's good, what's bad, will be helpful. When you plant, you want to make sure that you water them really well, because they, when you do plant into that mulch, it dries out a little bit faster, and you want to water it so that those roots have time to grow down into the soil. So the first year you might have to water it, every week, especially if we don't get any rain. But really, like after that, unless we have like weeks and weeks of no rain, you don't need to continue to water as long as you put the right plant in the right place. Be careful about, watching who comes into your garden. My little bunny friend, that's my rain garden bunny, they like to eat little plants. And a little fence around your new garden is an insurance policy that might be well worth it. I've put in gardens and the bunnies haven't hardly touched anything. And I've also seen gardens go in and they have eaten everything. We had planted one garden in 2021 that I visited this past year, and I come up to the homeowner and she's like, they're all gone. I'm like, oh, that can't be. And she's like, the bunnies just ate everything. And I go back and I look at her garden and they had pretty much eaten everything. But the plants were still there. Most of them were still there. They were just really, really small. So they fenced the area. We put in some new plants, and I think it's doing a whole lot better. I have had some success with animal repellents, like when you first plant, like spray those on maybe every couple weeks. And then once the plants get bigger, the rabbits generally tend to leave them alone. And I say generally because sometimes they still come and eat stuff. And my solution to that is just more plants. It's really my solution for pretty much anything. It's more plants. If you have insects eating your plants, well, that's good, but more plants. And then, as far as maintenance is with the dead vegetation, brown is a very pretty color too, and those stems in the winter and fall provide habitat for other insects. They burrow into the stems of the plants and they overwinter there. So it's really important to leave that vegetation as long as possible. And you get some really cool looking plants in the winter when the frost comes or the ice comes. Really nice. So then, in the spring when it starts warming up, if you feel the need to cut things down, that's fine, but try to leave it up over the winter. So we've talked about, where to put it, how to do the garden, but we haven't talked about where do I find these plants? And that's what we're getting to right now. But the first thing I need to do, besides take a drink of water, is this public service announcement. So native versus nativar. So nativar is a native cultivar. And you will find native cultivars or nativars for sale many places. And one of the ways that you can tell the difference between the native straight species plant, the plant that if you collected seeds in nature and grew it again, that's the plant you would get, versus something else, is the name in quotes. So both of these plant tags say, coneflower, Echinacea purpurea, but the one further up says Echinacea purpurea, pow wow wild berry. So when it has that additional kind of fun name, that's your clue that that's a cultivar. And one of the issues with cultivars is that a lot of times they're propagated vegetatively. So a plant is divided or cloned. So you basically have the same DNA, the same exact plant going out. So you don't have that genetic diversity that you get with the straight species. And that lack of genetic diversity could, if conditions change, you don't have that resiliency that the diversity gives. The other problem is sometimes, and you can see in the pictures up here, is it changes the plant quite a bit. They make it a different color. They completely change the structure of the flower. The bees that visit the flower in the lower left might not even recognize that those other flowers are something that they can get food from. And there hasn't been a lot of research done on this, but what they've seen so far is that cultivars that only change the size of the plant, so there's a cultivar of New England aster that's, I forget what it's called, but it's a shorter one, because New England aster can get really tall, but it's a shorter one. The flowers are pretty much the same, the leaves look the same. From the research so far, it shows that, yeah, that's probably all right. I would still encourage you to try to get the straight species whenever possible. And the other thing, if they change leaf color, like leaves are usually green, but there's a cultivar that's purple, that's not good, along with the different kinds of flowers. So now that we're done with that public service announcement, we'll move on to places that you can get native plants. One of the places you can do is you can sign up for the Oregon Nature Alliance's SHARE program. We'll have that announcement, usually goes out sort of the end of June, early July, where you can sign up for a yard visit. We come and we talk about what you can do in your yard. If you're interested in a native plant garden, we find a place that you can put those plants. Then we ask you to kind of prepare that area, and then we come with the plants and we plant them for you. You can ask Rachel there. We did it at her house this past year. And then we also give away free plants at our Monarch Festival that we've done the last 2 Septembers. And we try to grow plants for that are good monarch nectar sources and milkweed plants. So those are a couple places. Generally when you're buying native plants, they're probably about this size. You can get them bigger. You're going to pay a lot more money for larger size pots. But some of the other places that you can get native plants, Plant Dane is a program through Dane County and the Madison Area Madison Area Municipal Stormwater Partnership. The online ordering will open up in February, so if you go to the Ripple Effects website, you can sign up to get notified when that comes out, but there's a very economical way to buy native plants. They usually offer about 50 different species, and you have to order them in multiples of 4, but you order them, I think the ordering usually closes sometime in March, and then you pick them up in May. So they're not ready till May, but they do come from one of the local native plant nurseries, so they're very, very nice looking plants. Another local native plant sale is the Friends of the Arboretum, and they have their pre-order up now. You can pre-order, I believe, shrubs and maybe some trees and maybe trays of plants, and then they do a plant sale or a tent sale. It's May 20th at the Arboretum. Not as economical because they're fundraising for the Arboretum, so just be aware, but they do tend to have some really good, lots of different species, some that you might not be able to find other places. And then, of course, there are the native plant nurseries. These are some of the bigger ones. Agricol is more local. They're located just outside of Evansville. And these all have very, very good websites. If you're looking for information about native plants, go to these sites because you will find all that you need to know. Most of them ship plants. Agricol, if you want to save your shipping charges, you can go to the greenhouse and pick up your plants. And they also sell seeds. So if you're interested in starting native plants from seed, maybe a little bit more economical, you can order them here. Prairie Moon is really the only one that will sell little packets of seeds. Otherwise, you're ordering by the 1/8 of an ounce of seed or something like that. And this is where I should have had a slide about the library's seed library, because the Oregon Nature Alliance collected some seeds from the local natural areas with permission and gave those to the library to put in their seed library. So there's, 5 or 6? 6 different species of native plants that you can get for free at the library. And then once you've done all that, you have your garden, again, share that information. There's a number of different organizations that will provide signage that you can put up. It just gives somebody an idea of like, oh, that's why they did this. And like I said, we need to get more people doing this. We need to tell our neighbors, tell our friends, help them do it, get down in the dirt with them. But there's even ways you can sort of put yourself on the map, which is kind of fun as well. So to kind of wrap things up, we learned quite a bit tonight. We answered a lot of the who, what, where, why, and how. We talked about native plants. They're adapted. They've been in the area for thousands of years. They've co-evolved with all of the wildlife and climate. They're what grows here naturally. Why are they important? The whole food web, they absorb the energy from the sun and provide that up the food chain. And they provide a lot of very good benefits for us humans as well. We talked about what you can do. One of the best things you can do is start planting native plants. And then how to do that, you might have a little prep if you're going to create a new garden, but it doesn't have to be big, and you can start small, and there's a lot of resources out there for you. And with that, if there's any questions, I will take them.
2 slides back, there were organizations. I'd like to see that slide. Yes.
This one? Okay. Yeah, the certified wildlife habitat, there's a checklist that they have online that you can go through, and I have food sources, I have a water source, and then you can, if you send them some money, they will send you a sign.
And some people in Oregon talking about jumping worms. Are you familiar with those?
I am familiar with jumping worms. Jumping worms are considered an invasive species. They're a type of earthworm that does really alters the soil structure in how they use the soil, and it makes it so that other things can't grow. And there are, I believe, people have said that, so there are some places in Oregon that do have jumping worm, and that is a really good reason to be very careful about sharing plants. If you're digging something up out of somebody else's yard, you really need to make sure that they do not have any jumping worm, because there is it's not an easy thing to get rid of. I don't think there's any, as far as I know, very good way to do that, and they really can harm the soils and the ecosystem. So be very careful about sharing plants that way. All right, well, I really appreciate you coming tonight and paying attention, and nobody fell asleep, I don't think, so thank you very much. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me there, and I'm always happy to help. And if you're interested in the Oregon Nature Alliance, look us up on Facebook. Thanks.